What's up, everybody? Blessed be. My name is Manon, and you are watching Witch in the Working, where we will be discussing all things witchy in and around, throughout and about, above, below, and beyond. Please visit me on my other platforms as well, including Facebook, Instagram, and Patreon, all linked down in the description below. The full script to this video and most of the others is available on my Patreon account for download if desired. What makes downloading these scripts really cool is that with them, you can begin to put together your own Witch in the Working Book of Shadows to access great information anytime in a witchy, vibey way. Also, please visit my Shopify store listed in the description below to get your Witch in the Working shirts, mugs, stickers, bags, beanies, or what have you. Throughout the ages, there's been written recording of events, stories, findings, recipes for both medicinal and simple enjoyment of consumption, whether foods or alcohol, and discoveries from things mythical and unbelievable to modern day typical happenings that have been being performed for centuries and now just a common spot in everyday life. Cultures have developed and been writing documents and books for thousands of years and will continue for as long as we inhabit this planet. The magic societies, wizards, and witches are no different. For centuries, our magical ancestors have written down their healing recipes and incantations. They've recorded the spells and rituals that work so as to keep a consistency and a know-how for the years to come, as well as train their next generation of magical practitioners for future endeavors. In this episode of Witch in the Working, we're going to take a look at what we have come to know as a Book of Shadows and break it down, tear it apart, and jump into it. So without further ado, roll the intro. Welcome back, everyone. So as I mentioned in the intro, we're going to talk all about this Book of Shadows that so many of us utilize in the occult world today. We're actually going to touch on three items: a grimoires, a Book of Shadows, and a newer concept called a Book of Mirrors. Many witches and other occultists today will express their opinions that a grimoire and a Book of Shadows are the same thing. In my opinion, these two items are different in nature and design, but not by leaps and bounds of any sorts. The main difference between a BOS, a Book of Shadows, and a grimoire is that a grimoire is a magical text that has been created and distributed as a source that is set in stone and meant to be obtained by whomever has the money or know-how to obtain a copy. Not a very personal text, literally a book of instructions that is filled with descriptions of how to make magical items such as charms, talismans, and amulets, filled with rituals and spells to call on demons, angels, and spirits. The grimoire is likened to a manual or encyclopedia of sorts. It contains the basics of the ritual verbiage and instructions, spells, and potentially magical properties of various objects and items. A Book of Shadows is a book that a witch or other magical practitioner will create and utilize that contains their magical practices, for instance, sabbats, rituals, esbits, an assortment of spells, whether for love, money, healing, or hexing. It may contain sigils and practices for creating talismans and amulets, and even some of the more extreme practices like a grimoire will hold, such as practices of summoning and invoking beings and deities into the witch's presence. The key difference being that a Book of Shadows can be a very personal text just for the witch or magician, designed and meant to be altered and revised as the practitioner grows and experiences new practices and outcomes. The easy way to say it is, grimoires are dedicated and set in stone texts for the masses, and a Book of Shadows is an ever-changing, growing magical creature that is meant to grow and be a part of the owner. Now, as far as the Book of Shadows is concerned, there's some special cases where it's almost treated like a grimoire, but this is usually within traditional Wiccan or witchcraft groups. But we will get into that shortly, so I'll get to there. So the reality is these two texts are very similar and yet very different. Like everything in the occult, it can be very confusing to the novice. Goddess, please don't use the term baby witch. Ugh. Anyway, but hopefully after this video, you'll have a little better understanding. So let's talk specifically about the grimoire. So as per Wikipedia, it is most commonly believed that the term grimoire originated from the Old French word grammaire, which had initially been used to refer to all books written in Latin. By the 18th century, the term had gained its now common usage in France and had begun to be used to refer purely to books of magic. Owen Davies presumed this was because, quote, many of them continued to circulate in Latin manuscripts, end quote. However, the term grimoire later developed into a figure of speech amongst the French, indicating something that was hard to understand. In the 19th century, with the increasing interest in occultism amongst the British following the publication of Francis Barrett's The Magus in 1801, the term entered the English language in reference to books of magic in general. There are dozens of grimoires that have been produced and distributed over the last 900 years. The Black Pullet, the Grand Grimoire, the Greek Magical Papyri, the Magus, the Picatrix, the Key of Solomon, the Lesser Key of Solomon, Liturgia Goetia, Almadal of Solomon, Ars Nova, the Grimoire of Armadal, and the Grimorium Verum, just to name a few. All designed and written by magical occultists through the centuries, painting the pictures and laying a magical foundation that many of us use today in our witchy practices. As I discussed in a previous video about the differences between ceremonial magic and witchcraft, most of these grimoires were written by the socially elite, and to get your hands on a copy of these grimoires centuries ago, more than likely you too were going to be within the ranks of the aristocracy as well. But nonetheless, they were created and very informative and very important to our occult practices today, whether a magician or a witch or what have you. Most of these grimoires can be obtained today via Amazon, rewritten and translated in multiple languages for the masses. Again, as a text that is set in stone and permanent like most books, it's easily obtained and copied unchanged for centuries, ready to be absorbed and teach generations of peoples over the centuries again and again for those who seek out their knowledge and fulfill their curiosities. I felt it important to express this again, to help to differentiate, in my opinion, and many others as well, between the grimoire and the Book of Shadows. A grimoire, set in stone and unchangeable. Book of Shadows, very personal and moldable as you grow. Now let's talk about the more popular and more utilized Book of Shadows. A Book of Shadows, so to speak, is a relatively newer concept. In fact, many believe that it first comes to fruition and the concept is created by the very man who revived a European style of witchcraft known as Wicca. Gerald Gardner was initiated into a traditional form of witchcraft in 1939 by one Edith Woodford Grimes, craft name Daffo, not Dorothy Clutterbuck like many texts will wrongly suggest. It would be later on in years, throughout the 1940s, that Gerald would start a journey to share and begin his quest to publicize to the world this Wicca that he so adored and cherished. He was very much terrified that this system that he learned would wither and die like grapes on a vine if he didn't somehow, some way promulgate this great and diverse religion and practice. Along with publicizing via radio programs, magazine articles, and co-founding a witchcraft museum on the Isle of Man, he also continued his practice of this new religion and began to start and teach covens. As Joe began to teach the masses of this Wicca, he at the same time had to fill in the blanks in many areas of this religio magic, in essence using his best judgment and knowledge, a lot of it from some of the ancient grimoires, utilizing more ancient materials and revising it slightly to fit a quite diverse practice which utilized both a god and goddess. Many ancient grimoires, though certainly not all, portrayed a god figure only and its deital forces, and this wasn't going to work in the whole for Wicca, which sees creation and life itself as a masculine and feminine energy without which existence would be null and void. In these teachings, he introduced a magical text, not that much different from one of these ancient grimoires. It was a book of magical formulas. It contained rituals and spells, instructions on how to create sigils, talismans, and amulets. It contained instructions on magical alphabets and invocations and prayers to the Lord and Lady, as well as individualized spirit forces. It contained concepts of working with otherworldly forces in the elements of earth, air, fire, and water. It contained methods of meditation and path workings that Gerald found useful, that he gained knowledge from other cultures and revised to fit this Western style of magic. It contained recipes for incense, oils, and brews, and magical practices such as puppet work, candle magic, working with the forces of nature like the winds and the undines of rivers and lakes. Within its bindings were written key components of a witch's circle, like the altar setup and tools that are utilized in different rituals to be practiced within a circle's sacred boundaries. All of this and much, much more. I mean, to be honest, I could go on for hours, if not days, to discuss everything in a modern-day Gardnerian Book of Shadows, for instance, but We are not going to do that. So originally, this Book of Shadows was only to be held and owned by the high priest and priestess of a coven. Once a couple or a woman decided to start her own coven, this would be passed on to them or her so that the invaluable information between its covers could be shared and taught to the next generations, but in tight secrecy and within oaths that were taken, not to be shared with the general public, so to speak. Why not be shared with the general public? Because the bottom line is that Gardnerian tradition of Wicca is one of many mystery traditions that exist and have existed for thousands of years. All mystery traditions are an initiatory practice and all contain the same three elements that make most all magical traditions that involve initiation the same, and this is during an initiation, one goes through a symbolic death and rebirth, a bloodletting, and a passing of an ancestral power of some sorts. Whether you're a shaman deep in the Amazon basins with your millennia-old tribe, or the newer traditional Wiccan groups or ceremonial organizations such as the OTO, for instance, all initiations share this concept. And because this concept of initiation must be practiced and specialized, so to speak, it's a mystery tradition that one must choose to go through the same thing that their fellow initiates went through, and these practices are passed down from person to person in traditional Wicca, from male to female or female to male to be specific. And without this occurrence, it simply cannot be. This isn't all Wiccan traditions, by the way, so don't start slamming me with a bunch of negative comments and how dare yous. This is simply the case with traditional, British traditional to be exact, Wiccan practices. And no, you don't have to be initiated in a tradition of witchcraft to call yourself a witch. Let's clear that up right now, again, before we start getting slammed around here. Regardless, as time went on and Wicca became more popular and books from authors all over the world started flooding the market, the concept of the Book of Shadows started to get out there, along with the rest of Wiccan tools, rituals, and practices. Only now there are tens of thousands of people who love Wicca, but they don't necessarily have or want a coven to practice with. These are called solitaires, and they are no better nor worse than a coven-based witch. See this video linked above about solitaires versus covens, and also linked down in the description below. In the end, it's all about preference and convenience on whether you decide to be a solitaire witch or a coven working witch. As you'll see in the video, they both have their pros and cons. So as Gardner passed this Book of Shadows down his line to coven after coven, the Gardnerian Book of Shadows didn't necessarily stay exactly the same. This is not a published book like a grimoire we discussed earlier. This is simply a tradition-based book that is kept solely within the confines of the Gardnerian tradition, for Gardnerian eyes only. So in essence, once this book was received by a newly formed Gardnerian coven, it was really now for that particular coven's downline moving forward, for that downline's eyes only. So many Gardnerian covens, as the years went by, developed different ways and snippets of doing things that worked for their particular coven. So as not to be forgotten, a high priestess would add a ritual or spell to the Book of Shadows, so her downline would also reap the benefits of this awesome little tidbit moving forward as well. So why am I explaining all of this? To show you that this is why the Gardnerian Book of Shadows and many other British traditional Wiccan covens do not pass on a grimoire to their particular downline, but actually this coined Book of Shadows. Why is it a Book of Shadows? Because it changes and evolves as the years move on. It is a growing and breathing entity that is revised and expanding ever outwards as the years go by and the different downline covens come into possessions of it and add to its pages. This to me is extremely cool, as of right now, for instance, I own a Book of Shadows that make up thousands of pages because of this very practice. Moving right along, solitaire practitioners and eclectic covens alike began to learn through the hundreds if not thousands of published Wiccan instructional books about creating and starting their own Book of Shadows. A Book of Shadows, as it's known to the masses today, is simply a book that a magical practitioner keeps and writes down within its glorious pages their magical practices. Witches will write down all of the practices I mentioned earlier, from rituals, spells, concepts, practices, altar setups, magical correspondences, methods for different magical techniques, etc., etc. Again, this book is meant to grow over the years and with the practitioner, and is usually very personal, for their eyes only, but not always. It's completely up to you. Some witches like to share their findings, knowledge, and techniques. Either way, it's completely up to you or your tradition. So how do you go about building your own Book of Shadows? Physically, I completely recommend you get something that pages can be moved around. There are tons of fancy schmancy BOSs on Amazon with elaborate decorations that can cost from tens to hundreds to even thousands of dollars. The only thing I don't like about many of these is that the pages are fixed. They can't be moved and you can't take away or add. The best Book of Shadows are those that pages can be manipulated within. For this reason, one of my favorite BOSs as a quick and easy start is a 3-ring binder. I also get those clear page protectors chapters designed to go into 3-ring binders. In these, I place the pages of my BOS, and if I need to add or move something, it's simple. You unlatch the rings and place or move the section. I'm also a firm believer in never take away, just add. Ritual, for instance, that you decided you never want to do it again, leave it in the book, because never is a very unstable circumstance. Don't go throwing shit away willy-nilly, and if you outgrow your book, get a bigger one and transfer what you already have over to the new one. You can also have multiple books if need be, and 3-ring binders can be decorated as well on the outside, so your book isn't so, bland. And you can find blank books on Amazon as well that have pages that can be added and moved. They're a little bit tougher to find and generally more expensive, but they do exist. How do you get started filling your BOS with content? Just start. Just do it. The one thing you may want to do is split your BOS up into rituals, spells, and practices. In the ritual section, you would write down or type, yes, it's okay to type your pages up and print them out if you wish, your 8 Sabbats that you practice and how you practice them, your full moon or moon's Esbits, your new moon Esbits, ritual for hand festings, a ritual for coming of age, a crossing over ritual, consecration rituals, erecting your temple, closing your temple, etc., etc. Anything that, has to do with ritualistic practice. In your spells section, obviously write down any spells you like or have designed. Also include here ingredients or different incense, oils, and brews you may like. Any sigils, amulets, or talismans that tickle your fancy, correspondences you may need to look up in a pinch, and you don't have to make these things up yourself either. You can grab your favorite ritual or spell from a good book you like and just jot it down. The point is, it's in your Book of Shadows that will be sitting in your magical space, ready to be opened and worked with. No Scott Cunningham's Encyclopedia of Magical Herbs sitting on the altar. That's just... you want to have your BOS. To put like some kind of common textbook on your altar is just so unmagical in my opinion. Many times in magical practice, there's a feeling, an atmosphere that is created so that we can get our magical witchy senses tingling. Wearing a robe, for instance, and having that altar with tools in front of you is great, but nothing beats opening up that big black book of spells, incantations, and rituals. That just gets the juices flowing every time. My point is, it feels much better to work with your BOS than to have a published book sitting on the center of your altar or a nearby bookstand, or a lot of times even just like loose pages sitting on a table that you happen to print out. It just feels so much better to have this book that's sitting there and ready to roll. For the practices part of your BOS, keep your meditations and path workings if you have any. Do you perform specific breathing practices or have a method for working with chakras or your third eye? This is where it should go, in that section. Things that aren't necessarily a ritual or a spell. Do you have a certain way you choose your crystals? Different divinations you might practice would also go here as well. Let's take a look at a couple of BOSs. This is Pink's BOS and how she designs it. Very flamboyant, so to speak, but very creative in just the way she likes it. This is my Coven BOS when I work with my Coven. I can show you a page or two here because it's the outer court version, so it's okay. It's not oath-bound, in other words. But as you can see, it's very plain Jane. It's just to get the job done. This is another BOS that I had from a long time ago, from about 25 years ago. It was one that was with an outer court coven I was working with. So what about this third book I was speaking about, called the Book of Mirrors? And this is a very new concept in New Age light. In fact, I had never even heard of a Book of Mirrors in my 31-year witchy career until I started doing a little last-minute research for this video. So apparently a Book of Mirrors is a book that as a witchy person a witchy person would keep as a sort of magical diary, like literally. It's not that they write in it every day like a normal diary, it's a diary for your magical practices. So for instance, if you perform the full moon ritual you've written in your Book of Shadows, you would write down after the ritual what happened and how it made you feel in your Book of Mirrors. If you decide to do that money spell you've written down in your Book of Shadows, after the spell you would write down how it went and how it made you feel and the result you received in your Book of Mirrors. So in essence, it's literally a magical practice diary that is used to record the results of a ritual, spell, or other magical practice you performed. This is actually a really great idea, as it is a reference to be able to go back and see how a certain ritual or spell at any given time worked out for you. It may cause you to make some adjustments to perfect it down the road a little better, for instance. For this reason, I recommend if you do keep a Book of Mirrors, you should also record along with the date and approximate time of the spell, the moon cycle, and any specific weather pattern at the time. For instance, if it was raining that evening. These little things make a huge difference down the road when looking back. In my practice, we've been doing this for decades, where we have a chosen scribe whose job is to write down the date and practices, as well as any other important key things that stood out during a particular circle, in a coven book that we kept at the coven stead. It was especially useful when someone would do a drawing down the moon invocation and we could record the message being given by the goddess. I just never knew there was actually a term for it. We always just called it, like the circle minutes. I love the term Book of Mirrors better. Maybe I can talk some of my guard family into using this term. I don't know, I can give it a shot. They probably won't go for it. Maybe they will, I don't know. So to wrap this up in a neat little package, a grimoire is a book of magic that has been written and is a permanent literary work, unchanged for centuries. A Book of Shadows is a book that is created and kept up with changes and revisions by a witch or other occult practitioner that is an ever-evolving text to be referred back to over and over again, full of witches' spells and rituals that they performed. Many times this Book of Shadows that the witch created is a very personal book just for themselves or their coven. A Book of Mirrors is a book much like the Book of Shadows, only it's solely for recording the experiences that the witch had while performing activities from their Book of Shadows. Well, that's going to wrap up this episode of Witch in the Working. Do you have a Book of Shadows that you work with? What about a Book of Mirrors? Let us all know in the comments below. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe. When you do subscribe, ring that little bell and choose all to be reminded of future exciting episodes to come. I love you guys and gals. Until next time, blessed be.